Thank you all for your patience while we entered the 21st century, or the 20th might be a better bet. And are you going to be able to show the film clip to the kids? So maybe the kids should come up forward instead of having Eric on the stairs, because you won't be able to see the clip. A little film clip. Ashley, you want to come up closer too, or can you see?
This video is about 8 minutes long, and I just want to preface it by saying, the password, you should just...
I'm sorry,
Where did it go? It's right here.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
type in RJ there,
Okay.
and it'll pull it up.
Good.
So this is, I'm sorry to say that this is not the...
Let me start slower, and we'll get to this in a minute.
Oh, we're not ready.
We're not quite ready.
Okay.
Catch your breath. As that famous book about Zen and meditation said, this is a Zen book for grandmothers that was given to a friend of mine at a bar mitzvah party. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. If you forget to do this, you'll be in big trouble. I do want to make two quick announcements by way of welcome. One is today's collection being at the first of the month. Our first Sundays, we always share our collection with a local social service agency. Today we'll be sharing with the Interfaith Council for Action, IFCA, which many of us know, and which in about 1968, the Ethical Society had a major part in starting. IFCA buys dilapidated housing, rehabs it, and provides housing, as Emily I'm sure knows well, for folks in Ossining to live in good housing at modest rent with social service support. It's a wonderful organization, and it's a pleasure to be able to share our collection with them today. Second announcement I want to make before we begin is that recently, and I have permission to announce this, through the actions of the Westchester Refugee Task Force and other organizations, a Syrian couple has been settled in Chappaqua. The husband is a special immigration visa holder, which means that he's one of those people who worked with the Americans in Afghanistan, and his life is in danger if he stays there because he worked with us. So there are some good newses happening with regard to refugees. There are a couple of other families in process. I will let you know when I get the word and when I'm told that it's okay to announce it. But everything is being done rather quietly, as you can all understand at this point, to get people settled and comfortable. We don't have any word of any needs for housing stuff, so keep your extra beds and kitchen equipment in your garage or attic for a while. We'll let you know if there's a need for it coming up. Having entered the 21st century, I think we're all set. Let's have some music from Joanne, who I think will be singing with Karen and singing along with Roy playing. The Nightingales of Northern Westchester.
And since it is fall, we are doing Heart's-Beat, the fall song. This one is a Schumann, I think. Yes, Schumann. And it says, the leaves are falling from the trees, the delicate summer leaves. Life with its dreams is falling apart, just like the leaves into ashes and dust. The birds in the woods were singing. Now the woods are silent.
Yeah, yeah.
Love is gone.
Yeah, yeah.
She's right. Love is gone. The birds are singing no more. But we welcome you, winter. Because next year everything will come back. Welcome winter, because with your pure white new dress, you will gather the jewels of summer and preserve them for next year.
Yeah.
Shall we? Let's do it. Das Laufeld von den Bäumen, das zarte Sonnenlaub, das Leben mit seinen Träumen zerfällt wie Asch und Staub. Ja, zerfällt wie Asch und Staub. Die Vöglein im Walde sangen, wie schweigt der Wald jetzt still. Die Liebe ist fortgegangen, ein Vöglein singen will. Ein Vöglein singen will. Die Liebe kehrt wohl wieder, in Liebe kühlt den Jahr, und alles kehrt dann wieder, was jetzt verblunden war. Du Winter sei willkommen, dein kleines Reich und Lohn. Er hat den Spuk genommen, den Spuk bewahrt der Thron, den Spuk bewahrt der Thron.
Since there are some folks here for the first time, I should say we always ask our speaker to share with the Sunday school students the thrust of what will be shared with the adults. Today is special because there's a little video, after which the kids can go upstairs and we'll continue with the adult meeting. Mika, thanks.
So, this is actually not the completed version of this video, so you may notice that the sound is a little bit uneven, and it may drop out and be a little bit hard to hear, but we'll do the best that we can. Can you click on full screen here, and then just hit play? About 8 minutes long. It kind of speaks for itself.
My name is Leanne Nunez. I just turned 15. I'm a freshman in high school. Last year when I was in 8th grade, my school was big on restorative practices, and what I mainly saw were circles. Topics were introduced, we talk about it, building community and bonding. It was about finding each other's humanity and like speaking to the socio-emotional aspects of the school, and it just felt really amazing. So today was a day full of panels and workshops, and I moderated a panel on restorative justice and practices.
What is your experience with sitting in circles with other people? Would anybody like to start?
Being in circle gives the students a place to have their voice. That connects to restorative justice in the sense that it's not always like teachers making the final decision on everything. Like, the students can't really get their say. So.
Restorative justice is about community building. If you've ever been in a restorative circle, you can feel the healing effect of it.
The main premise of the circle is that it equalizes people. Restorative justice is an open-hearted approach dealing with problems where harm was created?
Restorative justice is being represented and feeling that there is a piece of you in the greater whole.
If I could define restorative justice, I'd probably say an alternative to punitive measures where you're focusing on uplifting students and trying to keep them in the classroom instead of pushing them out.
A definition I really like is a relational approach to addressing conflict. And this is a way to deal with conflict when it arises, rooting it in personal relationships that matter.
Restorative justice to be in the New York City schools and to be in the penal system as well is important, because New York is the biggest city in the United States. If we take the humanistic approach to our kids here, then other places are going to look to restorative justice because New York's doing it and being successful, and we're just starting to be successful now.
New York City needs restorative justice, transformative justice practices in all different areas, particularly I think school systems, so we can touch more people that way. New York City has the largest public school system in the country, and it's very inequitable. It affects people's lives, and not only people's lives, it affects specific communities, Black and brown communities disproportionately.
What draws me to stuff like this is restorative justice is about a balance between the students and everyone else in the building and the building itself. If I can say that I'm like a social justice warrior, or whatever you want to say, then there's a call for justice. Like there's something wrong, and if no one else is going to do it, why can't I? Now we're going to have a Know Your Rights session. Amy and Emerald, who are lawyers, they're going to basically tell you what happens during like suspension hearings.
There's a recent report that came out about 2 weeks ago, which was fabulous and detailed the cost of the school to prison pipeline and looked at the disparities both in the cost of suspensions and the racial breakdown. Yeah.
I've been in education for almost 50 years now. And when I was dean, at first I was a traditional dean. If someone messed up, I was putting them out, because my school, though it was a nice small school, I suspended in 1 year more than 300 kids.
So, Black students were removed last year for the 2015-2016 school year 24,530 times. Latino students were removed 18,122 times. White students were removed 4,000, a little bit more than 4,000 times. And it's also important when we talk about
It is a cycle where when a student is not in school and you're making it harder for them to be in school from everything that's happening, it will lead to this school to prison pipeline. Most of the time for some of these students, school is one of the only places where they can be in a safe environment. And if you're taking that away from them, there's so many variables that could occur.
I know a couple kids that have that are actually going through foster care right now because of different chain of events that's happened from being pushed out of schools. I see kids coming back from superintendent suspensions like lost, but they don't want to admit that. It's like the tough thing to do to not say anything, but these kids are really suffering.
A lot of students, when it comes to discipline, feel that they are powerless. What makes also peer mediation and restorative practices so helpful is that the key word in peer mediation is peer. There aren't any power dynamics that make them feel uncomfortable. So when you have the offender with his other peers, he's more willing to trust them, or she. They're willing to trust them more and come up with a solution and feel that this person can potentially look out for you.
I'm a peer mediator this year, and something that I like to do, you reflect with the person and you show them like, yo, I've been there in your shoes, I know how I feel. Like me, I used to get suspended a lot when I was in elementary and middle school. I used to get in fights every day, I used to get in trouble. I didn't really have those restorative methods, and nothing happened to me. Like I got suspended. When I was a kid, I addressed that to him, like, I made that mistake too. Like that's not the route you should go.
Restorative justice gives us a chance to really help young people grow. We're teachers. We have to teach. We have to teach people how to handle their emotions, how to live together, how to work together. I mean, that's our job.
I think shifting the framework and really having those opportunities to have genuine conversations will help us to learn how to separate a person from their behavior.
I think the best way you could really become great at doing these mediations and stuff is to constantly do it. You gotta put yourself involved in it. And honestly, I don't know, I just get a sense of love of doing stuff and helping people. Because it's like, when I do these mediations, I see myself in these kids, you know, and like, my principal told me, like, I changed. And everybody believed in me, you know, like they told me I changed. I didn't believe in myself, but eventually every day they tell me, oh, like you changed, I'm proud of you. So I give that same love and that same encouragement to these students, and you witness that, and it's like, damn, like I'm being something to these kids, and this is actually helpful. So,
I just love, man, what this guy said. Can I keep singing? I just love what this guy said. It just makes me feel good, like good vibes.
The amount of love and care and that you have for the students and friends in your schools are just, it really makes me happy.
I love seeing young people of color succeed. So his story and everything he said was really touching to me. I was on the brink of tears, honestly.
But actually, it's just an entire movement that involves community members, that involve parents, that involve young people, looking at restorative justice as like buffers, as like safety zones within schools.
I hope to see that around the city, that we take the peacemaking model and we really incorporate it in our criminal justice system. And then in the schools, the same thing. So I see New York in 20 years in an ideal world that this is something that takes off across the city.
When it comes to decision making and deciding what policies should be implemented in schools, you turn to the students and you ask, are you okay with this? There's levels to everything. There's always more than one side to a story. Kids are more than a number.
I think Ann can take the Sunday school folks upstairs, and there may be some things to talk about following this video.
Oh, what did I say?
Not yet. Oh, not yet.
Not yet. Mika is as eager to speak as I am to hear her, but I want to go through the program and structure. And David Tika came with some opening words for us, so let's hear David.
Well, I guess we all remember to set our clocks back this morning, right? I actually didn't remember. My son, fortunately, wakes up at crack of dawn every day, so I was lucky to catch it. But I'm going to take you guys back a little bit farther than the 1 hour, about 40 years to 1978, to a suburb in Chicago near where I grew up, Skokie, Illinois. In 1978, the American Nazi Party applied for a permit to hold a rally in Skokie. It was no coincidence they picked Skokie. Skokie was and still is a predominantly Jewish suburb in Chicago. At that time, it had the largest population of Holocaust survivors in the country. So the idea of hosting a Nazi rally in their town was offensive. It was actually shocking to most people in America. The town of Skokie denied the permit, and a legal battle ensued. The ACLU took the side of the free speech protected by the First Amendment and defended the rights of the Nazis to demonstrate. The case was appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, and in a 5-4 decision, they allowed the Nazis their permits. I remember the terror. This was never intended to be a peaceful rally. It was meant to stoke the fear and make the population of Americans feel marginalized and unwanted. Jewish people were being interviewed on television beside themselves with anger and disgust, some rolling up their sleeves to show reporters the numbers tattooed on their arms. The ACLU took a lot of heat for defending the Nazis, and support for the organization hit the lowest point in history. To this day, lawyers for the ACLU claim they did the right thing, by defending the rights of the Nazis, but it didn't seem like the right thing then, and it does not seem like the right thing now. I never had to send my kids to Robert E. Lee High School or drive down Jefferson Davis Boulevard to get to work, but many of our African American brothers and sisters do every day. In fact, there are over 12,000 roads, schools, statues, and other public buildings named after pre-emancipation, pro-slavery heroes in the South. Let's fast forward to the demonstration in Charlottesville, Virginia. I want to say that nothing has changed in 40 years, but I'm afraid things have gotten worse. You see, back then, the President of the United States didn't say that there were good people marching with the Nazis. I'm afraid that I'm amazed that we still allow white supremacists and all their associated hate groups to march in our public spaces. If it was up to me alone, they would never get their permits. I said that right after the violence in Charlottesville to a bunch of my coworkers, and their response was passionate. You know, they said, you have to let them march. It's about the First Amendment. No matter how sick they make you feel, you must let them express their opinion. It's about the Constitution. By the way, these are the same guys that want to make Colin Kaepernick stand up. You know? I took pause in their response. I wondered to myself if indeed I was becoming an advocate of some kind of censorship. The ACLU still holds the position that free speech must be protected at all costs. But in the wake of the violence that followed Charlottesville, they are rethinking their position, and they will no longer defend demonstrators that brandish weapons at rallies. I guess it's a start. But words can be used as weapons. I guess we have to ask ourselves a tough question. Should hate speech be considered free speech?
Let's take our traditional moment of quiet time together to breathe in and breathe out, and then I will introduce Mika very briefly.
Marvin and I were in Charlottesville a couple of weeks ago. We took a road trip down to Asheville, North Carolina, and it was encouraging to see the community responded with Seaville love, and outside of one restaurant there was a sign that said, if you're not comfortable with diversity, this is not the place for you. So hate speech can be countered with love speech.
And that's a very good segue into having Mika speak, because I think that's part of what restorative justice is all about. You can read about Mika in the program, so I won't say much about her except she was born in Woodstock and brought with her someone who's known her since she was 2, Emily Sack, who may not appreciate my mentioning that Emily was the daycare director of Mika's preschool. So that's bringing an old friend.
Very old.
I can blame Emily for meeting Mika, because I was walking outside my house when Emily and Mika walked up into my street. And I said, "What's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this, Emily?" She introduced me to Mika and asked Mika what she was doing, and she told me. And I said, I don't think I said it right at that moment, but I think I called you and said, "Do you think Mika would come and speak at the Ethical Society?" So you can blame your attendance on your former preschool director. I won't ask you when you graduated from Sarah Lawrence, but I want to ask you later, because I worked at Sarah Lawrence. We might have overlapped. On that note, the founding director of the Restorative Justice Institute, MicaDashman. Thanks, Mika, for coming. Let's see if it works.
Yes. Great.
Amazing.
Forward,
Oh,
back, forward.
a clicker.
Yeah, a clicker.
Amazing. Okay.
I think it's amazing it works at all.
So great.
There we go.
Okay.
I will stand by when the thing fails.
Thank you all, and thank you for your patience. I'm sorry we got started late. Tell me how much time I have. So
2 or
I
3
can
hours, is that all right?
time it accordingly.
Maybe half an hour?
When do we stop?
We can stop 12:15, 12:20.
Okay, so I hope everybody enjoyed that preview of that video. That is a project that we've been working on since the spring, working with a film production crew to create a series of videos about restorative justice in New York City in particular. And that is the longest of the videos that we've created, which is, as you can see, focused on restorative justice in the schools and its application to the school-to-prison pipeline. So what is restorative justice? There are many different definitions. So a good general definition is that it's an approach to wrongdoing that brings together everybody who was affected to acknowledge the harm that was done, to consider how best to redress the harm, and to prevent it from happening again. So I came to this work through the legal profession. I went to law school initially because I had an interest in justice and social justice in particular. And in my mind, justice, which is one of those terms that can be interpreted many different ways and is by many different people, to me that means fairness and freedom from suffering and liberation from oppression. So I graduated from law school in 2005, and I went to work as a civil litigator. I represented poor folks with disabilities, and I did that for 8 years. And what was one of the things that was very frustrating to me about practicing law, and in that context in particular, was that in the context of the adversarial system in which we were working, even when my clients won their case, of course we never went to trial, so everything was a settlement. Settlement, of course, involves compromise, right? So even when they won, they didn't really experience justice. So they may have been able to keep their apartment, or maybe they got some kind of financial award, but they didn't necessarily walk away from that process, from that legal process, from the courthouse, feeling like they had been heard and acknowledged, and that somebody had taken responsibility for the harm that they had endured. So my issue as a lawyer was always with the adversarial system itself. I liked representing clients, I liked working with people, I liked being an advocate for people, but the system itself never felt right to me. It always went against the grain of my personal values and how I wanted to be in the world and be interacting with people. Because in that system, there is always a winner and a loser. And so I had this vision, even as I was practicing law in that context, I kept thinking, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a way to create justice where we are restoring the dignity of everybody involved and promoting healing and fostering meaningful accountability, which isn't necessarily the same thing as punishment. So restorative justice presents a completely different paradigm of justice. It's important to say that it's a different paradigm from the one that we're used to, but it's not new. So the term restorative justice, while it was coined in the late 1970s in Canada, really traces its roots to indigenous practices around the world. indigenous values and practices for community-based conflict resolution. So restorative justice has many different applications. So as you saw in the video, it can be applied in schools and is increasingly gaining popularity in schools as an alternative to the types of punitive, zero-tolerance disciplinary practices that came into vogue in schools. And I think it's important to say that these punitive practices in schools actually increase during the same period of time in our country's history while we were ramping up mass incarceration. And that's not an accident, right? So the same ideas and stereotypes and prejudices that led to mass incarceration also led to the school to prison pipeline, which disproportionately penalizes young people of color. So it can be applied in the schools and also in criminal justice and also in community-based settings. So restorative justice starts by asking a completely different set of questions from the questions that we ask in our mainstream criminal justice system. So our retributive criminal justice system asks what law was broken and who was responsible and what form of punishment do they deserve. But restorative justice wants to know who was harmed, what are the needs and responsibilities of those involved, and how can all affected parties make things as right as possible. So when I first learned about restorative justice, first heard the term in 2013, the question that immediately came to my mind was, why haven't I heard of this before? Does this exist in New York City? I had been practicing law at that point for 6 years. I went to CUNY Law School, so I'd been living in New York City for quite a long time. Traveled in pretty progressive circles and spent time with a lot of my colleagues. We're all public interest lawyers. I had gotten interested in law school actually in alternative dispute resolution, so I'd taken 2 basic mediation classes at that point, and I had been doing some community-based mediation in Brooklyn and Manhattan. And I heard the term restorative justice for the first time actually in the context of an article in the New York Times. And I couldn't believe that this had not come up in my professional context or in the mediation work that I was doing. And I wanted to know why. So I started to investigate. And what I found was that it does exist in New York City. There are a handful of programs in which restorative justice is being implemented within the criminal justice system. There are a number of schools that have implemented restorative justice practices into their school discipline and community building. There were community-based organizations that were using restorative justice, and there were folks who I met who had been exposed to restorative justice. They had been trained, they had done the work in an agency somewhere outside of New York, and they had come to New York, and they were still really interested in restorative justice, but they couldn't quite figure out like how to get involved, how to plug in, because it was hard to know what was going on. There was no central entity or clearinghouse in which you could go and find out, oh, this is the lay of the land for people who are interested in restorative justice in New York. So that was what I created. I created Restorative Justice Initiative, which is a citywide, New York City-based multi-sector organizing and advocacy project seeking to increase access to restorative justice practices for all New Yorkers. I started Restorative Justice Initiative in 2015 because of that need that I identified for some central organizing sort of force and glue to connect the people who were doing this work. because I have always really felt that social change is a function of relationships. So it seemed to me that, especially with something like restorative justice, where a key core part of the theory is this understanding that we're all interconnected, and what happens to each one of us impacts the whole. It seemed to me particularly necessary that folks who were involved in this work and wanted to be involved in this work be connected with each other, have an opportunity to build community and share information and resources with each other. So that's what we started to do in 2015 with Restorative Justice Initiative. We now have over 2,000 people who are part of our network, and what they get from Restorative Justice Initiative is connection, community, collaboration, and support. We do that in a number of different ways. So restorative justice is a relational approach to justice, and people often ask, well, what's restored in a restorative process? It's not justice. Actually, it's human relationships and dignity and respect and empathy. So I talked a little bit earlier about the adversarial system, where the assumption of the system is that the optimal outcome for one party is incompatible with the optimal outcome for the other party. But in a restorative process, we look at things very differently, and we see that it's actually possible to meet the needs of all impacted parties. I don't know about you, but that was such a relief to me to discover that there was a process that could create an outcome that actually worked well for everyone at the table. Another thing that's really important about a restorative justice process is that is the way in which it brings in community participation and community voice. So we all know that we have a jury system in this country, and that the design of the jury system is to give community voice in the resolution of legal matters. But unfortunately, it doesn't actually work that way in the vast majority of cases. Primarily, there are all sorts of issues with juries and how they're picked and who's on them, and that's a whole conversation for another time. But the more important point about juries is that most people don't get in front of a jury, because most cases are settled through a settlement process, both in the civil system and in the criminal system. But particularly in the criminal system, this is so key, because the criminal system, in the criminal system, one's liberty is at stake, the defendant's liberty is at stake, and over 95%, depends on which group you're looking at, if you're looking at national numbers or state numbers or New York City numbers, but it's over 95% of criminal cases are settled through the plea bargaining process. So this means that there is no community input. So a plea, this is what a plea conference looks like. It looks like horse trading. It's a defense attorney and a prosecutor making a deal together in front of a judge, and the defendant doesn't have anything to say about it. Maybe the defense attorney is whispering in that person's ear, and if it's a crime where somebody was harmed, where there was a victim or complaining witness, that person has nothing to do with the process, no input, no participation whatsoever. So this is really a big problem in our system, and one that I think that we don't talk about enough. So restorative justice is a community justice process, and it brings that community participation back to the resolution of legal cases, and particularly criminal matters. So the other thing that restorative justice allows for is to put people's actions into context. which is not to say that knowing the context is an excuse for our bad behavior, but it's really helpful to know in terms of figuring out where do we go from here, right? How are we going to prevent this from happening again? And how are we going to create resolution for the people who are harmed? So in the criminal justice system, it always focuses on a specific incident of where a rule was broken. And restorative justice allows for a much broader inquiry, which can build empathy and understanding between the parties and lead to more individualized, and I would say really more effective and impactful solutions. So this is an example from an actual case somewhere, although not one that I participated in as a facilitator, but a young person participated in a restorative justice conference with the young person had shoplifted from a small business, and at the conference, restorative conference, was the young person who shoplifted and the small business owner, and it becomes clear during the course of that conversation that the young person can't find work, and so doesn't have any spending money, and so decided, that the only option was to help themselves to something in the store. And after a long dialogue in which a lot of different things were said, everybody said what they needed to say, the store owner actually offered this young person a job in the store. So you never know what can come out of a restorative process. People are infinitely creative, and when they put their minds together and they really see each other fully and they know the full circumstances that led to even a criminal act, you never know where it could go if we give people this opportunity. So within the large umbrella term of restorative justice, there are a number of different restorative processes. So restorative processes can take the form of a circle, which you heard about in the video. And so that could include peacemaking circles, sentencing circles, harm circles, and community building circles. There's also a restorative practice called conferencing, which subsets are community conferencing and family group conferencing. And then there's victim offender dialogue or victim offender mediation, which was actually the first restorative justice practice that was brought to this country, which is, and the way that victim offender dialogue works is it's actually most often used in crimes of severe violence, and the dialogue in question will take place post-adjudication, post-sentencing. So somebody is already serving time, incarcerated for a crime, and because the person who has been harmed or the survivors of the crime initiate it because they want to have a conversation with that person, they want to have a dialogue, they have questions that only that person can answer. There are many states that will allow, including New York actually, that will allow somebody who is a victim of a crime or survivor of a crime to go inside a prison and have a facilitated restorative dialogue with the person who committed the crime. So there's just a few figures about restorative justice in the US. So 35 states actually have legislation on the books that allows restorative justice to be used. It's often a surprising statistic to people since we don't hear about it very often here. And that is also part of the reason why I started Restorative Justice Initiative. Because when I started to research this and look around and figure out for myself the answer to this question, why hadn't I heard of this sooner? One of the things that I discovered is that New York City and New York State are not innovators in this area. You know, we're a little bit, we're behind some other U.S. cities and states in terms of enacting restorative justice legislation and implementing these programs in our criminal justice system and in our schools, actually. And then 31 U.S. states have victim offender dialogue programs, including New York. So some of the programs that operate in New York City within the criminal justice system that are restorative in design are Common Justice, which is a very unique diversion program for people who are facing charges for serious violent felonies. And it started in Brooklyn. It was a pilot program of the Vera Institute of Justice, and it's now an independent organization that's operating in Brooklyn and the Bronx. So they receive referrals from the district attorney's office, and it's a 15-month, very intensive diversion program for folks who are facing those charges, and the person who has been harmed can be as involved or not involved in the program as they want to be throughout that 15-month period. The Red Hook Community Justice Center is a community court operated by the Center for Court Innovation, which runs about 8 community courts around New York City. And they're an organization that has been involved in lots of criminal justice reform, the development of community courts, and problem-solving courts all around the country, actually. And so the Red Hook Court is in a particular neighborhood in Red Hook, Brooklyn, not Red Hook, up in Dutchess County. And they have a peacemaking program, which is really interesting because they have taken a very specific model of peacemaking that comes from the Navajo Nation that was given to them by Navajo mentors to use, and they implement it pretty faithfully. So there have been a few tweaks to adapt it to the cultural context of Red Hook, Brooklyn, but it's pretty faithful to that traditional indigenous practice. And I'm actually doing their training now, so it's really interesting to see, to actually be in there and learn more about peacemaking. And the New York Peace Institute, which is the Community Dispute Resolution Center for Brooklyn and Manhattan, runs several restorative programs. So they actually do a restorative mediation for criminal court cases. They're low level.
Sorry. That's what happens when we didn't fiddle. Okay, hang on there. Here we go.
It's going very well. This is the first time.
Make sure everybody was up.
And it worked. I want to say this is actually the first time I've done this slideshow. I was very reluctant to develop a slideshow about restorative justice because I think the best way to learn about restorative justice is to be in a restorative process. But I've come to learn that you can't do that in everywhere you're invited to speak, and that people like slideshows. So, so thank you for letting me test this out on you all. So, yeah. So I think that language is really important. How we talk about the language that we use in general, but in our criminal justice system, kind of cements a certain mindset about the people who are involved in that system. So I really try to be mindful not to use the terms victim and offender, although they are the name of that process, victim-offender dialogue. But I do think that we should be moving away from those terms for a variety of reasons. One is that the nature of being human is that we have all caused harm, and we have all been harmed. right? So it's not necessarily very useful to identify with one of those roles or the other, and to identify people in perpetuity with a particular role. The other reason is that we know that most people who commit violent crime in particular have also been witnesses to and or victims of violence and trauma. So if we're only talking about them as offenders, we're missing the whole past history of learning that led up to that action. And our legal system also recognizes certain types of harm, but not others, right? So just because something is a crime on the books doesn't mean it actually caused someone harm. And there are all sorts of ways that we harm each other for which there is no criminal penalty or remedy, right? So restorative justice really embraces a much more expansive understanding of harm. And also, our legal system punishes certain groups of people disproportionately. And that's, that's really important because there are lots of us who, because of our, our circumstances and our skin color, have gotten a free pass, because many of us have broken the law in various ways and hurt other people, but we're not criminalized for it. And other people are, so that's really important in terms of thinking about moving away from identifying people with those roles. And also, not all people that have been victimized identify as a victim, right? Some people identify as survivors, and so it's not necessarily the way people who have been harmed want to be thought about as victims. So I also think it's really important as a restorative justice practitioner and advocate, which I am, to talk about accountability and see if we can kind of reframe this idea, which has become very wrapped up in the concept of punishment in our system. And I don't think that punishment actually does create accountability or meaningful accountability for a variety of different reasons. I think that accountability is really an active, multi-step process, whereas punishment is a passive process. It's something we do to you, which is really actually, in many cases, incompatible with an individual taking responsibility for harm caused. So what if we imagined accountability as a multi-step process that involved acknowledging harm, first of all, acknowledging your responsibility for causing the harm, taking steps to make things as right as possible, and to decrease the likelihood that it will happen again. So if we had a justice system that was based on that type of accountability process, it would look very different than the system that we have. So the promise of restorative justice is huge, I think. It can bridge the current divide in our criminal justice system between people who are on both sides of the equation, people who have been harmed by crime and people who have committed harm. And it provides for both healing and accountability. It can reduce our reliance on incarceration and allow us to be more responsive to the needs of those who are directly and indirectly impacted. And restorative justice also recognizes the counterproductive effects of defining individuals solely by their harmful actions and poor choices, and it honors the potential for change in us all. So I just wanted to say just give you some quick stats about the school to prison pipeline, which came up in that video, because this is a huge, this is a really a growing application of restorative justice in the schools now. And as you heard in that video, and as you all know, New York City has the largest public school system in the whole country, and it's starting to implement restorative justice, has not been implemented district-wide. So there's a lot of there's a lot of room for growth there, and there's really a lot of need for change in restorative justice in the New York City public school system because of the disproportionate impact of punitive discipline on young people of color. So some of the manifestations of this are that there are 5,511 New York City Police Department School Safety Division personnel, and only 2,800 guidance counselors and 1,200 social workers employed to support the city's 11 million students. I don't know how many of you live in New York or have lived in New York City, how much you know about the system, but the New York City Police Department has a whole division of officers called the School Safety Division in our schools, and they are many of them are authorized to detain and arrest students. So no wonder we have a school to prison pipeline, because once you have police officers in the schools, it's so easy for a school discipline, a school-based infraction, a school disciplinary matter to turn into an arrest and a trip to Rikers Island and everything that comes after that. And that's really devastating for anyone, but for young people in particular. And Black and Latinx youth make up 92% of all arrests and 91.7% of all summonses and 91.4% of all juvenile reports, highly disproportionate to their presence in the schools, which is 67%. Wow.
Wow.
Yeah. We have a lot of work to do.
Are these police officers were having guns?
No. No, they are not armed. So just a few quotes that I like that I think are relevant here, and I think I have to stop. But Buckminster Fuller said that in order to change an existing paradigm, it's not that we should struggle to change the existing model, but to create a new model that makes the old one obsolete. So when people ask me what I think about criminal justice reform, I think, yeah, okay, we can reform the system. And what I'm really interested in doing is creating this new model of justice that eventually is going to edge out the old one, because people are going to see that it works so much better to accomplish the goals. Eleanor Roosevelt said, justice cannot be for one side alone, but must be for both. And I love that quote. She was a restorative justice advocate before her time. And Fania Davis, who is a former civil rights attorney, she's also the sister of Angela Davis, and she is a restorative justice advocate and the founder of Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth in Oakland, California. And I love this quote. My dream is that restorative justice might help move us from an ethic of separation, domination, and extreme individualism to an ethic of collaboration, partnership, and interrelatedness. And I think from that quote you can really see the very broad applications for these principles and practices. So here's our information about how to keep in touch with us. I also have some brochures that people can take if you would like to find out how to subscribe to our mailing list. Look at our website and keep in touch with us. And I would be remiss if I didn't say, in my role as director of Restorative Justice Initiative, that we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Most of our funding at this time comes from individual donors, and a couple of small foundations. So we are always looking for more funding partners. And if you have questions about what exactly we do with the money that we get, I would be happy to tell you more about how we use that funding. So thank you very much. I look forward to talking to people later.
Can we take some questions and comments for a bit?
If we have time, yeah, sure.
Let's have a few questions. Joanne, you got your hand up.
Yeah, and I think this is wonderful as a preventative. Is anything being done after you get into prison?
So restorative justice can be applied at every stage of the criminal justice system.
It can be, but is it?
Yes. But let's see. Let me think if there's an example in New York. Well, yes, there is. There's one organization that's been using circles at Rikers Island with young people. I know that one of my colleagues who runs an organization called the Restorative Center, which is in New York City and also in Newburgh, was talking about going to Sing Sing to do circles. I'm not sure if that's happened yet because I know it's a very long process to get permission to go in and do work within the state prison system. But in other parts of the country, there's a lot more programming within prisons. Oh, there's actually a very important example here in Westchester. Let me not forget. So in the county jail in Valhalla, there's a program called. It's gonna come to me when I'm not trying to think of it. So it's a program that was developed in California in the San Francisco County jails. And it's a program that works with men specifically who have committed violent crime. And so it uses a curriculum called Man Alive, which is all about kind of investigating the link between ideas, concepts of masculinity and violence, and teaching folks how to find more constructive ways to deal with anger. And this program has been implemented in some form in the Westchester County Jail. There's a really, I've met the commissioner there actually and his program director, and there's a lot of programming in the county jail here. I don't know if you all know that. And I mean more than there is in a lot of other jails. And this is a really interesting program because it kind of upends the traditional idea in corrections about how to deal with folks, the most violent folks in the jail, where generally they have been, the conventional thinking is that they should all be separated and dispersed around the jail. And in this program, they're actually all housed together and they spend many, many hours per day in these groups. They sit in a circle and it's like group therapy and a bunch of other group processes. What makes it a restorative process is that a part of that curriculum is what we call a surrogate victim dialogue. So in other words, people who have been victims of violent crime, who have decided that part of what they want to do for their own healing process is to tell their story to people who have committed violent crime behind bars. They will come in and they will tell their story. And by hearing the stories of these victims, not necessarily the people who they harmed, the folks in the circle, in the cohort have harmed, it can help them to begin to think about their own people they've harmed and, build empathy and understanding for that perspective.
Liz, well, you can point, you can see.
Thanks. It seems like a really lovely idea, and I'm all for it in general, the idea that we should all be talking to each other. And I just want to come back a little bit to, I was kind of reeling for the first half of your talk because I was thinking about what David said, because it made me feel kind of terrified. the notion of banning hate speech, because while David might make choices about what is hate speech that I would agree with, in reality, the people who would make those decisions are the people in government. And personally, I don't want Trump and Jeff Sessions making decisions about what qualifies as hate speech and telling me that, to cite Colin Kaepernick, you did, that it's hateful for him to kneel, but you know, they're all good people in Charlottesville, right? Like, so you have to think about who's making these decisions. And as you were talking, and so that's really where my mind was this whole hour. Not that you didn't give a lovely presentation. But in talking about it, and particularly in the elements of what goes into this, you know, number one, acknowledge harm, you know, really stood out. And like, wouldn't everything be better if we could, you know, get people to acknowledge the harm that they've caused? You know?
How do we get to that point?
Right, and it's so
Yeah.
easy to be so defensive and hateful and just say, no, you're right. I mean, that just seems to me an incredibly difficult but worthwhile task.
Yeah, and it's a big question. It's a big question in restorative justice. I mean, this is generally a voluntary process. So, you know, there are all sorts of people who, you know, who have caused harm. People, and let's also point out, like, not just individuals, but institutions and governments. Restorative justice also includes truth and reconciliation, which is, you know, which is a process for dealing with widespread, long-term mass injustice and atrocities. And so how do we get people to that point? And I don't know all the answers, but there are things that we know about setting up a process that sort of sets the stage and makes it more likely that people will acknowledge harm. And one of the ways that you do that is you give the people who were harmed an opportunity to tell their stories. And there's something very powerful about hearing in someone's own words, this happened to me and it changed my life in the following ways. That can really start to create that shift where somebody who has been very defensive up until that point might be able to say, oh, now I understand. Now I understand the impact.
I was very interested in your comment about the county jail, because we have to understand that the vast majority of arrests, convictions, plea bargains are for misdemeanors. And that's all in Rikers Island, which is a god-awful hellhole, and all of the county jails. That's where people have their sentences 1 year or less. If you can intercept them there through this process, it seems to me that that's potentially cutting the future felons off at the pass. But then you have to think about, okay, outside of the city of New York, there are 57 counties, each with their own county lockup. You know, Oswego County, you know, whatever, and trying to spread that out there, I think, is difficult. But I would suggest to you probably one of the most important things you can do, because at that level, nobody's been killed. You know, nobody usually, okay, and it may be robbery or Class A misdemeanors or what have you. And if we can intercept it there, it works a lot better. And one of the things I sort of saw because I was involved with the development of the arbitration mediation in New York State, one of the first places we went to was the St. Regis Mohawk Reservation, and we observed what one of those councils, how they call them. And it was the most astounding thing I've ever seen in my life. I just sat there dumbfounded as I was watching how all of this worked out. And a few years ago, New York State said, we will take all of the decisions of the tribal councils and enter them in the county clerk's office. You don't have to go through the civilian court system. And I think, so that kind of thing, I think, is encouraging.
Yeah. Was there a question in there?
No, my question is how much are you, is there more of this restorative justice thing being rolled out into the other county jails that you know of?
I know of, so there was a re-entry planning circle project in Western New York. So what is the county that Rochester is in? Is that Monroe? I think it was in Monroe County. And as with many good initiatives in the court system, it was around for a while and it lost its funding. And so, that's always an issue for these kinds of innovative things. But, that's a process where they would use a restorative circle, essentially, where family members would be invited, and it's sort of a hybrid of re-entry planning when somebody is going to be getting ready to be released from jail after serving some time, and and actually with an eye toward rebuilding relationships, right? Because there are often a lot of fractured relationships in the wake of somebody serving time in jail. Because even if it wasn't a serious crime, right? We know that lots of low-level crime is related to substance use and addiction, right? So there may be a whole host of convoluted, complicated relational issues that just really otherwise, outside of a process like this, just never get addressed in our criminal justice system. So providing an opportunity for family members to come in and have that dialogue and be a part of that planning process, discharge planning process, is actually, I think, a really great model.
I have to share this because most of you know I lost my only son after 4 daughters when he was 20 years old in a drive-by shooting when he was coming home from New York City on the West Side Highway.
Mhm.
It was just 2 minutes one way or the other. He would have missed it, and he was a junior in college. However, have a long story short, we were middle class from Westchester, and he was a junior in college. So we got tons of attention. It was all over the newspapers, it was everywhere. And me being me, I called every day for 4 years until they got on. I was not letting this go in the back burner. And we got all sorts of great help. Well, anyway, they got the people. There were a bunch of kids who were 23 years old from Washington Heights who were members of what are called the Wild Cowboys, a big gang from Washington Heights. After years, the whole, between plea bargains and one thing and another, the whole thing came crashing down. So they got the 3 of them that were in the car that night. One got 250 years to life, and by plea bargaining, the other 2 got 25 to life. Anyway, these were 23-year-olds, and when this happened, talk about anger, I wanted heads cut off, bury them, that's the end of it. I don't want to hear about them getting out of jail. I don't want to hear it. Well, as the years went by, Tricia Mello and one thing and another, and about 7 years ago with Bob and a few here, we were involved in kind of restorative justice in Usning. And a lady there who was very involved in it, who had been in jail herself for 20 years but was out and doing great work, invited me to go up to Greenhaven and talk to 100 men up there who were away for a long time and tell my story. So I went, oh, okay, and then got there and thought, oh my God, what am I doing? This big gray building and the doors clanging behind you, and it was quite an experience. But I got there and there were 100 men in the room, so well behaved. And I shared last night, no black people, all Spanish or white or Asian or something like that, but they're all up there for back things. So I told my story, and they couldn't have been more polite, nice, pleasant, and questions afterwards. But one guy came up to me afterwards and said, I want you to know that I was a member of the Wild Cowboys. And I was not involved in that, but I was involved in the Wild Cowboys. And all I can say is, I have to say I'm sorry. And that meant a lot to me. But you know what meant more than that was it suddenly dawned on me, those guys were 23 years old when they did this. They're away for, could have been way in their 50s by the time they come out. Their lives are gone. And in 2 years, I can now go and I can make my plea to keep them in for another 20 years. Or I can be involved in some kind of restorative something. And I'm still not sure what I want to do. But that's a personal thing. But that guy saying he was sorry made a difference.
Thank you for sharing that. Yes.
I just have I was trying to green my neck to see if you were here. I'm so thankful you're here. Just getting back to what you said and what David's introduction was, along with your, putting together with your talk. I was thinking maybe small towns could do that with regard to people petitioning to basically protest. What if they said, we're going to honor your First Amendment rights, all good there, but you have to sit in a circle with other people with different opinions. So if you want to do it that way, come on in. But unless you want to do it that way, you have to stay home. Now, do you want to sit in a circle or not, Mr. Madison? And I think that it takes more guts to sit in a circle than it does to be an angry sign carrier, right?
Yeah.
So I would invite all the Nazis to my house as long as they sit in a circle.
Good idea, Holly.
Great idea.
I don't know. I have to figure out what food to serve, what a Nazi is.
Bring them up here, Holly, and we'll walk around.
Great idea.
Let's take one more question. Susan has been waiting.
What is the biggest obstacle to restorative justice?
Yeah, that we're very ingrained in this mindset that has perpetuated the existing system, right? It's not the success rate of the existing system that has kept it going, right? Because it's a complete failure if you look at the numbers, right? It completely fails to do at least what it purports to do, which is to create safety and, and to rehabilitate people. That's why we call corrections corrections, because we're supposed to be correcting something, but actually we do the opposite to people. Changing that mindset that equates.
Is it mostly governmental?
I think it's both, right? I mean, I think our elected officials are a reflection of our collective psyche. And, and anytime there's an election of a district attorney or really anyone, it's like this topic of justice reform, law and order, it always comes up, and people feel that they have to be tough on crime, and there's so much pressure to be quote unquote tough on crime. But what is tough on crime? Because the way that we have gone about it has not accomplished the goals of actually preventing further crime and keeping people safe.
Maybe it would be even tougher if the person who has to see what he has done to these people would sit there and see what he has done.
I think so, and I think that's a good point that you made, that it's harder to sit and circle than it is to wave a sign. And I have heard people say that. I've heard people who have served time and gone through the traditional criminal justice system and then have had an opportunity to participate in a restorative process, dialogue process with the person they harmed, say, that was the hardest thing I ever had to do. Sitting face to face with that person and facing that individual and hearing what that was like for them and how my actions altered their life forever was way harder than sitting in that cell and doing my time. And so we have to shift the way we think about what it means to be tough on people who have caused harm and what that actually looks like and what we can set up to create the possibility for people to change in a positive way. What kinds of support do they need to be able to change in a positive way?
Thank you.
Can you make it quick?
Yes, I'll try.
Holly was joking. Holly,
No, I'm not actually.
No, wait, let me finish. I don't mean about the circles. I loved your idea about the circles. So you were sort of joking about you'd have to think about what to serve. And actually, I think there's something very important about
sharing food and beverages at some of these kinds of processes. I had one experience that I treasured many, many years ago. The Westchester Mediation Center had a pilot project in juvenile restorative justice.
Yeah.
We were trained. I participated in one case. I don't know what happened to the program. The first half, shall we say, was quite tense. The kids were there. The families and support people of the kids were there on both sides. And the victim the one who was harmed had an opportunity to really express it. The person who had caused the harm got to talk about their role and to apologize. And then we broke for refreshments. And you could feel the tension in the air dissipate.
Yes.
And the families were talking warmly with each other, and then we sat down and everyone brainstormed, how are we going to redress this situation?
Yeah, that's such a good point, and it really is. It seems like a small detail, but it actually is really important, and it is an integral part of many of these models. It's a little bit harder when you're running a program in the context of the court system, or you're going into a jail, right? But in many community-based settings, breaking bread together is actually a very important key part of the process.
Let's pause, have some music, and then we'll continue with the closing. Don't worry, Milt's going to pass a basket, Vera. And remember, we're sharing with IFCA today.
This is bombs. It is the seeds. And with a name like the seeds, you would think it's about nature and seeds. But those things are really love songs. So it says, all the winds are sleeping on the mirror of the river. Cool shadows of the evening are covering the tired ones. Luna is putting a veil around her, over her face, reflecting on the dreaming dusk on the water. Everything is quiet on the sea. Only my heart, only my heart will not be still. In the river of love, everything is tumultuous, and where the seas will not stop till the boat has sunk.
Typical
God, I didn't know we were going to do Good luck song. We end on this one, that's right.
This is getting weirder and weirder, man.
But it's bombs.
Go for it.
Breathe in, breathe out.
Luna,
Thank you,
That
Walter.
guy needs some restorative justice.
Thank you very much, Mika. It's a longer day than usual, but I cannot conclude without my own brief thought and a brief quotation. The approach of restorative justice is informed with a deep, profound respect for human dignity and worth, and with an understanding that all human beings have a potential for growth and change. Which reminded me of a tape I heard of a man whose house had been broken into. I believe it was in England. The man who broke in stole a television set, but the two of them met later in some restorative justice program. The man who had stolen the television set said, "Look, it's just a TV set, it's not worth very much." The homeowner said with great emotion, I'm making this tape much shorter, homeowner said, "Yes, I could easily buy a new TV set, but I cannot purchase the sense of safety and well-being and calmness of mind of my wife and children whose lives have been violated and whose safety has been destroyed, whose sense of insecurity has magnified enormously." The man who stole the TV set at that point began to weep. He said, "I didn't realize what would happen. I thought it was just a TV set, a couple of pounds. You could buy a new one." Something happened there that changed, I think, both of those people. Felix Adler, who founded the Ethical Society, I've got 2 paragraphs. One is very short. He asks at one point, he says, "The question, is life worth living, implies a species of blasphemy. The right question to ask is, am I worthy of living? If I am not, I can make myself so. That is always in my power." And then he gives us an envoi, which I think is important today. This is for all of us, from whatever tradition we might come. We are to go out as teachers among the people, discarding the limitations imposed by the theologies of the past and holding up the moral ideal, pure and simple, as the human ideal, as the ideal for, forgive me, all men. He's a mid-20th century writer, but he changes, as the ideal for all men, embracing all men, binding on all men. The ideal of a perfect society, of a society in which no man or class of men shall be mere hewers of wood and drawers of water for others, in which no man or woman or class of men or women shall be used as tools for the lusts of others, or for the ambitions of others, or the greed of others, in which every human life, the life of every man and woman and child, shall be esteemed a sacred utterance of the infinite. Let us go out among the people, but let us first stop and have some coffee in the living room. Thank you all for coming.